I will be your chair. There's another chair. There's a lot of panelists. I'm going to ask you guys for your names and what order you're speaking in. So on opening government, who's going to be speaking first? Just first name's fine.
Ashish.
Okay. And then speaking second.
Michael.
Okay, opening off.
Jasmine speaking first.
Okay.
And Mivzal second.
Thank you. Closing government.
Speaking first is Julia Milton.
And second is Julia Kirby.
Okay, second off. Henry speaking first.
And Tony speaking second.
All right, excellent. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister up to introduce this round of debate in a speech in exceeding 7 minutes. Here.
Who's timing?
Is someone timing?
All times.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, we've been doing it. So never mind, we have a timer.
All right. Yeah, we can. There is something genuinely bizarre happening in the status quo. If you are a child and your parent neglects you, the state forces the parent to pay you damages, often for the rest of your life. But there is no reciprocal burden. If you as a child who was dependent on that parent for your life neglects them, there's somehow no duty on your part whatsoever to ensure a basic minimum standard of living for the people who sacrifice so much for your life. Michael and I are going to close that gap. Our policy is fourfold. Firstly, we'd like to clarify that your obligation to look after your parent can have both monetary and non-monetary forms, right? It could be include obligations, say, bring your parent to a doctor, spend a minimum amount of time with them, for instance. Secondly, to the extent it is monetary, it will be based on your capacity to afford it, right? So it won't be a flat rate across everyone, because for a poor person, forcing you to pay 10% of your income might be really quite draconian. Thirdly, we'll say that the state will top up whatever is remaining. So there will be no starving parents in our case. To be sure, if you can only pay 5%, that's not enough, the state will pay for the rest. Lastly, we think that we're going to enforce this fairly aggressively in those cases where people are caught violating these laws. We think over time a norm will form where people generally take care of the parents, because if you don't do so, the risk of getting hauled before court and being forced to pay massive fines will be a huge deterrent. So I'm going to talk about two main points of standard. Firstly, the principle of moral reciprocity. Why it applies in this instance, and a child has a moral obligation which the state must enforce to look after the parents. Secondly, I want to talk more practically about why this actually fulfills many of the needs which parents has and why it solves some of the problem in the status quo with regard to relatively elderly parents. So firstly, moral reciprocity. I think we should accept, first of all, that the sacrifices parents make for their children are not just immense, but to a certain extent quite obscene. The point at which, as a 30-year-old, all your dreams and aspirations about the person you want to be die in a ditch happens when you have your very first child. From that moment, the financial pressures on you are immense. The amount of time you have to just have a good life when every single night your child cries at 3 a.m. when you need to change their nappies sounds trivial, but across the sum total of 3 years, it means your life is literally dictated by every single whim this individual has. Let's not talk about, no thank you, about the time and the money, the financial resources you plow into these individuals that you now cannot plow into achieving your own vision of the good life. Now I'm sure this wouldn't be as much of a problem if the decision to have a child and to care for it was a purely voluntary one. But that is not the society in which we live in. We tell you that parents are coerced into having children and caring for them when they happen for lots of reasons. Why? In the first instance, this does not cover all the cases, but it's important. Many parents just don't agree to have children, right? This is very prevalent among the communities in which familial structures are a bit weaker, especially low-income communities, right? Often, no thank you, a child, and this sounds cruel to say, is the outcome of a rather unfortunate instance of sexual intercourse, right? And even if you do consent to have that child, you don't consent to all that child's arbitrary peculiarities, like the personality they might happen to have. You might have wanted to have an obedient child. What if the child is incredibly recalcitrant, right? And you just spend a lot more time disciplining him. Yeah, go for it.
This seems to be a point about the society owing a responsibility to these individuals rather than the child owing a responsibility to these individuals, given that the child never asked to be born or had any control comparatively in this situation.
Okay, like if you say the fact that a child did not ask to be born means that nothing more of moral consequence can flow from that life, then that's absurd. Because then no moral consequence could flow from any life existing because all life is in fact arbitrary, right? So we don't think taking into account the fact that the birth is arbitrary is quite enough. The fact that child not choosing is not significant. But also look, there's huge amounts of legal coercion, right? The moment a child is born, you often have no choice. You have a choice between either adopting, which society massively condemns you for in the vast majority of instances, or you're forced to take care of the child, or you will be prosecuted for the exact same negligence laws we want to apply in the reverse direction. We also say there's just lots of biological coercion. It's an unfortunate fact about the way we are made, that, when a child is born, especially women are biologically coerced, just caring for this weird tumorous thing which came out of your body, because oxytocin floods your system and you have not very much choice in the matter to begin with, right? And all this is all apart from this, especially conservative societies in which you are obliged to have a child as a couple and then take care of it to continue the family life. So there's quite a lot of coercion, and the state basically tells parents, even though your relationship to the child is quite arbitrary, we're just going to make you look after the child because it's just too inconvenient for us to do it. But what does this mean? If the state coerces you, it then owes you a reciprocal obligation. In specific, the child owes you a reciprocal obligation, right? Think about how this works. When the state coerces you, we justify that on the basis that we give you some returns. When the existence of the child itself is the direct causal link with the vast majority of the coercion which the state places upon you. And crucially, when the child is the sole recipient of the benefits of all those coercive forces, the child is the one who owes that benefit back to the parents, in exactly the same way states owe the citizens' duties for coercing them under all sorts of circumstances. Therefore, it is profoundly immoral that all parents owe children obligations to not mistreat them. There is no reciprocal obligation. We are going to create that, and the state should enforce that. Secondly, let's talk about need. Let us first recognize that aged parents especially are a vulnerable demographic, and states rarely have incentives to cater for them in terms of welfare provision. For a start, they just are not a group of swing voters, right? Most of the time, by the time they reach that age, their views have changed and ossified, so political parties don't reach out to them. Most of the time, turnout among that group is high, but crucially, it's quite consistent, so most political campaigns do not cater to their interests. And let's not forget the fact that because they're not seen as economically productive, there's often little economic reason for states who are now quite fiscally conservative and general around the world to cater large amounts of welfare to take care of them. And I'd just like to point out, right, that many of the harms which parents specifically face in their old age stem from the fact that they sacrifice so much of their life for their child in the very first place. There's a reason why rates of depression among stay-at-home moms are some of the highest of any large demographic in a society. And all those harms I talked about, those become more severe in old age when you do not have the nest egg you need to live a good life. Crucially, why is it that the state cannot be the one paying for this, right? So apart from the political considerations about difficulty, why it's good if kids get to top up what the state cannot naturally provide, the needs of parents are not static. If you develop a sudden illness, if you develop a sudden psychological condition, right, going through the welfare systems takes months, if not literally years before that change ever happens. The state simply does not have the information with which to make the sort of intimate, day-to-day quick reactions which children can. So it's good that the state outsources duties to children who know parents well so that they can react fast. And note, this is the exact same reason why the state makes parents care for children. Because only parents know children best, right? So this is the exact mirror of the logic which we use to impose duties on parents. The exact reverse applies. For all these reasons, I am very, very proud to propose.
And as your remarks, invite the leader of the opposition to open up the opposition side of the debate. You're here.
All good? We think that open government spent more time arguing that because society places an obligation on parents, and because the child benefit from that particular obligation, they now have similar obligation to their parents. We think that's absurd because they lack the understanding of to what degree do that child benefit, right? Because we think benefit is also incredibly subjective. Because we are all individuals who have subjective values as to what we appreciate in parenting and what we appreciate in our early lives. Because if that child truly do not believe that that was a good relationship that deserved a similar reciprocal obligation, then therefore it's up to that child to believe whether or not he benefit from that particular parenting or not. So just because you allow that child to live sustainably, give that child some financial assistance and education, doesn't mean that that child will similarly appreciate that and believe that he will owe their parents similar obligation, right? We don't think obligation moves that way. We think it's more nuanced than that, right? So we think by large, they say that even though parents don't actually consent to this, and the reason why they have children is because of some societal obligation, we think that to some extent it's still much easier for them to consent into that. Absent of that, the child cannot consent at all into him choosing which parents, him or her choosing which parents that he got, how parenting works, and how he was brought up. So even if those choices are not entirely free choices, but they are still choices that people are able to opt into and not opt into, right? So parents can still opt out of having a child, but a child can never opt out of whether or not he or she was to be born, or whether or not that was the parent that he wanted to begin with. So we think that the degree of consent is significantly different. One absent, one a degree, and some consent present. And we think that despite the fact that you have some societal control over decisions, we don't think that that denies the ability of parents to understand the nature of that consent. So they can understand that despite all this societal pressure, that if I have a child, these are reasonable obligations that I can expect. I can reasonably expect a child to have like financial constraints on myself, or that I would have to spend a lot of time looking after this child, or I probably might have to stay up late at night to look after this child. These are reasonable things in which people are able to understand the moment they consent into having a child. Significantly different from the fact that a child had not consented at all to that particular decision. So what do we want in this debate? We think that in this debate, largely a good parent-child relationship are likely to result in such arrangement in which the parent and the child would always look after the parents, and we don't think that's a debate, right? So these debates are about children that otherwise would not have cared for their parents, and these laws would have had effect on those particular relationships. So what we feel about that is that, one, we think that it's justified to allow parents to have to care for themselves because, one, they have their whole lives to make financial or other plannings in order to ensure that their lives are taken care of at the end of the day. We don't think that it's fair to blame their child for either the lack of care that the parents put upon themselves, or that the parents weren't responsible enough to make such plans. So our principle is that each individuals are responsible for their own lives and their own decisions, because the parent has more control over that decision and what kind of retirement they can have over the child who could not make decisions at that point in time. So if the parents have go through financial constraints later in their life, that decision cannot be blamed upon the child who had no participation in that decision making, right? So we think that the parents now are more responsible for their own decision. And thirdly, we think they truly can't afford that. We're fine with state care because we think that this will ensure that they are reasonably taken care of, like emotionally, financially, and anything else. And we will further argue later on why why looking after parents by the state might be better than having children who are forced into that relationship with parents. But we'll move on. Firstly, I'll tell you that despite the care and parenting, that relationship, children cannot conceptualize what relationship they enter into, therefore they didn't consent to that particular relationship, right? So furthermore, we think that relationships are subjective in nature, right? Despite the fact that Ashish could come up here and say that most parents have to look after their child and wake up at 3 a.m. in the morning, that's not necessarily how every parenting or every relationship works, right? So even if some parents are not abusive or they don't hurt their child the way the laws say they hurt their child, right? We think there are many scars in which a parent can put upon a child that the law won't protect the child for. For example, a parent will not be verbally abusive, but might have hurt the child's self-esteem growing up. Those are things that the laws don't protect the children from. So these are all things that take into consideration when the child decides whether or not they want to have a continuous relationship with that parent post adulthood, right? We think this is extremely important because now we allow children, we allow the daughters or the son of these parents to choose whether or not they want to have a continuous relationship with their parents. We think that you should have that decision, that ability to make that decision before that closing.
So these old people who aren't taken care of because their kids don't like them particularly, would you still advocate providing state resources to make sure that their needs are getting met?
Yes, we think that they should be protected on state resources. We're fine with that, right? So thirdly, lastly, let's talk about the parent-child relationship that will happen under their side. Because they seem to be rather idealistic about this forced relationship. They say that this forced relationship will result in better care than the state care because these children would know what's in the best interest of the parent and will care and adapt to the needs of the parents. But we think a forced relationship in which their laws would create will not create such children that will care for the best interest of the parent and at best only do what the state enforces upon them, which is actually a lot more harmful on the parent than they would think, right? That means that a child very angrily having to transfer money or coming for visits, but not actually emotionally taking into consideration how an elderly feel is very, very harmful because sometimes their words might hurt and then the parents realize that their children are not there to truly care for them, yet have to be confronted with that forced relationship every day. We think it's significantly more harmful than a state care in which you don't have to be confronted with how much their children do not like them. We're extremely proud of those.
Let's hear for the remarks of the Deputy Prime Minister to finish off the opening government case. We're here.
Let's be very clear. What we are saying is that in a situation where a parent has not neglected their child at their most vulnerable, in their formative years, then the child should not neglect their parent when they are at their most vulnerable, when they return to that state of repeated childishness in old age when their faculties and their finances desert them. That is a very basic level of obligation. It is not the case that as a child you need to go and bring flowers to your parent every Monday morning. It is not the case that you need to be there to read them their favourite Chaucerian stories. It is simply the case that you need to meet that basic standard of care that your parent met for you when you were a child. They have grossly mischaracterised what we are asking of parents, and they have grossly mischaracterised the level to which parents have cared for their children. 3 things in this speech. 1, why this policy is just, why it leads to better care of the elderly, and why it leads to better parenting. Why this policy is just. They say the kids should determine whether they owe an obligation to the parent. This is a terrible metric. 1, because it has failed in the status quo, as we see from the fact that millions of middle-class parents, when they hit old age and their savings run out, are not cared for. When they get ill and need transportation to the hospital, they do not get it. They have to wait weeks for the state to send someone. When they need a mobility scooter, they have to wait months for the state to get it because their kid will not chip in or rent one for them. The reality is that if kids were so good at determining this, we would not see so many old people who have given their kids a home, who have given them shelter, who have taken them to school, who might not have been perfect parents, but who have made an effort, viz the fact they have not been sued for neglect, and are getting nothing in return, are being left for dead. So empirically this fails. But secondly, it's just not surprising that kids are terrible at determining how much they owe their parents. Because we all look at the world through rose-tinted glasses. We all want to imagine that someone else's childhood was better than ours. We all had higher expectations for how we would come out at the age of 18. More to the point, We always think we're being good children. I think I'm a good child. The truth is I'm a terrible child. I never come home from work, and when I do, it's just to ask my mother for dinner. But I tell myself that I am a good child because we all want to think that we're good people. At the end of the day, they might say the kid can evaluate, but the kid is the worst person to evaluate. Because as much as they may say, I want to do the best for my parent, they'll always think, well, I just have this one thing I want to do. I just want to go to this party. I just want to go on this date. Yeah, I just want to stay a little bit longer at the office, right? And you might think, well, surely people can rationally weigh these things up. But they can't, because these are often subconscious biases that exist below the level of rational thought. They're things that people don't process. It's cognitive dissonance. But it still happens. This is the fact that so many old people are living alone, unvisited, in spite of the tremendous sacrifice they made for their kids. Thirdly, though, it is just not the case that all the sacrifices you make for your kid are intangible. If your kid has not been neglected, you spent time with it. You've given it some degree of emotional support. It has had something to eat. It has had somewhere to live. It has had a home, right? That might not have been a perfect home. There might be many things surplus, no thank you, to that level of requirements that you have not provided. But you have provided that baseline level of requirement, and so your kid also owes you that baseline. And that is all we are claiming in this debate. Then they say, and this is clever, the kid can't opt out of having those parents. Okay, one, the parent can't opt out of having that kid. Right? Obviously they can when they put that kid up for adoption initially, granted, but in that situation this obligation clearly doesn't accrue. Right? So this is about cases where the kid has stayed with the parent for some time. Who put that kid up for adoption, age 5 or 6 or 7, voluntarily? Right? I can think of 0 cases. And the reason for that, the ones Ashish gave, the 5 different reasons he gave you why parents are pressured into looking after their children. Right? So realistically, you might say technically, legally they have a choice, but in reality, is that choice ever made? No, because it's not really a choice because of the huge coercive factors that are stacked against the parent that Ashish pointed out. Sit down. But then, okay, maybe there's a bit more optionality on the part of the parent. Let's take that. But the sacrifice that the parent makes for the kid is disproportionately larger than the sacrifice we're asking the kid to make for the parent in this case. One, because the kid is not being asked to spend all their time with their parent. They're being asked to meet a basic minimum of providing some degree of funding. They're not being asked to have the parent in their house. They're not being asked to take that kid to school every day. They're not being able to look after that parent in a time where it can do nothing whatsoever, which is what your first 3 years are. So yes, it might be the case there is slightly more consent exercised. But there is a whole lot less obligation being asked. So in the trade-off, I think we come out ahead. Okay, why are parents cared for better? They say let the state do it. First and foremost, we explain why in many cases the state can't for periods of time, when a parent gets a medical condition and needs care now, when a parent becomes immobile and needs a scooter now, and can't find their way through the welfare system, or it takes too long. That parent needs help then, and we think the kid should provide it. So the state cannot succeed in all cases. It's not as responsive as a kid. It doesn't know the parent's obligations. It doesn't know their needs. It's not there immediately. There's a huge bureaucracy to work through. But secondly, it is absurd in this debate to say the comparative is to perfect state care. That's not mutually exclusive with our policy, and to the extent you're able to spend the equivalent amount of political capital that we have on a policy that provides state care, we would suggest you won't get very far, because everyone thinks in society that kids owe obligations to their parents. Very few people think they should be paying taxes to look after everyone else's parents. So per unit of political capital, you're not getting a whole lot of dollars for old people through the state. So if you want to propose that mechanism, you've got to recognise that dollar for dollar, you can deliver a huge amount less. That was naive on their part. But finally, it's just absurd to say the state should step in here. If you believe that, then you should also believe that the state should be responsible for all childcare. That is false, because we believe that often parents are the best people to respond to the needs of kids. And that is where the analogy kicks in. Kids are also the best people to look after parents in their old age. Jasmine, you were popping up and down, have a shot.
So you're also assuming that this forced relationship you create will result in these responsible children
Understood.
that will always react.
I got it, I'm about to respond. They say, in some cases, the kid feels neglected, so won't respond well to their parent. Will make the parent feel pain by going to visit them. Fine. Then the parent says, don't come and visit me. There's a pretty simple way out of that problem. But secondly, let's be clear, yes, you might still resent your parent in lots of intangible ways that mean you can't sue for neglect. But the reality is, your parent was not bad enough to get you to resent them enough to sue them for neglect. So, at the very least, you owe them a reciprocal obligation not to neglect them. And that is all that we are asking. They've missed the comparative on this point. Finally, why do parents care for kids better? And this is very obvious. The reality is that we live in a society where in many communities, kids are not cared for. Perhaps because, as Ashish points out, they are unwanted. Perhaps because the parent just has constrained resource, both psychologically and materially. And in that situation, very often, parents just don't want to get sued. They give their kids minimal level of care and that is it. On our side of the house, the level of care you get is linked to how well your kid is doing, how much they can afford. So now, in your old age, you are directly tied to the success of your child. You have a strong incentive to look after that child. And you might say, well, parents don't think this rationally, that's not an immoral thing to think. But in reality, parents do respond to incentives to have kids. But more to the point, these parents clearly do, because they're not responding to all the love and affection that parents are supposed to provide. So clearly a more rational course is required. At the end of this debate, we owe an obligation to our parents because of the sacrifices they have made. It's a bare minimum, and we're proud to meet it.
Let's go for the remarks. Invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to finish off the front half of the debate. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be very systematic in which, firstly, I'm going to break down the obligation that individuals owe to their parents and whether or not parents are, as the opening government seems to conveniently characterize as people who are loving, sacrifice a lot to their individual children, and apparently create this sort of obligation. But secondly, I'm going to deal with what kinds of relationships or norms you create, because we think that in particular was a burden that the opening government took up in terms of how they change how children or society generally views their parents, ladies and gentlemen. We think it becomes a lot worse under that side of the house. I'll also defend the status quo that we defend as well, of whether or not the state is able to care for their kids, for parents or not. Now, let's break down obligation, ladies and gentlemen, because we think Michael was very glib in his responses to a lot of what Jasmine's analysis was. First and foremost, biological and societal coercion. We think this argument was absolutely absurd. Because, ladies and gentlemen, Michael never came back to much of the responses that Jasmine gave you to Ashish in regards to the fact that biological and societal coercion was never a point in which the children had any say or hand in that particular coercion for you to actually impose that obligation onto that child, to which Ashish just simply said that, alright, but they're the sole beneficiary to that particular transaction. But the fact is that child never really had a choice on whether or not there would be a beneficiary to that particular parenting or not under that side of the house. We think that's exceptionally important for us to acknowledge in this particular debate. Because if you're going to create a legal binding obligation for a child to have to take care to a particular individual, we would consider that that person would have to have some degree of say as whether or not they will have to opt into that particular relationship or obligation or not. Because under our side of the house, we think it's quite reasonable to say that individuals are autonomous beings that can make their own decisions and are responsible for their own decisions under that side of the house. So sure, we might concede to their worst case scenario in which societal coercion as well as biological coercion, whatever kind of coercion might occur on that side of the house. But fundamentally, these are adults that you also acknowledge can enter into contracts, can make their own autonomous decisions, can make their own decisions when it comes to medicine, medical procedures and things like that. Clearly, you yourself acknowledge that these are autonomous individuals that can make their own autonomous decisions at the end of the day. That means that these individuals have an infinitely greater amount of ability to consent to the kinds of procedures or the kinds of pregnancies or situations that they are opting into on that side of the house. Michael gave you a very glib response in regards to adoption, because apparently, ladies and gentlemen, adoption is in many circumstances not what we're talking about. But the fact that adoption exists as an option for many individuals in society goes to show whether or not individuals had an option in parenting or having that child and making sure that you created that obligation or not at the end of the day. That means that demonstrates systematically, ladies and gentlemen, that parents had many stages in that pregnancy or their life to be able to control the circumstances that they were in order to create the unfair circumstances that children are in under that side of the house. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the financial circumstances that these individuals are in. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this is another area of infinite possibilities that the parent could have engaged in as well. Not only did this individual have all their life to plan their finances, not only did their children not have any say how they plan their finances as well, and the children could not control because of the asymmetry of power and influence within the parent-child relationship. So if a parent makes a bad business decision, makes a bad investment and falls into poverty, ladies and gentlemen, how is it the children's fault given that they had absolutely no ability to control that particular position on that side? They can't even guarantee to us under the side of opening government that those financial decisions and the fall into poverty was caused by caring for that child or caused by spending money for caring for that child on that side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. Because they themselves cannot guarantee to us the kind of care that you give to their child is actually as sacrificial as they say it is. Some parents don't actually sacrifice anything, like don't give up their job, don't spend lots of money on their children, ladies and gentlemen, That's a completely subjective issue on that side of the house, one at which the state is completely inept in making that decision for those individuals at the end of the day. That's why we think that given the infinite circumstance in which parents may not actually sacrifice a lot, may not actually spend money and give up their lives, but have complete autonomy and choice over how they plan their own lives and own finances and their own future, ladies and gentlemen, we think in that circumstance, the child has absolutely no say, and it's pretty unfair to place the obligation on them on that side. Now, sit down. But thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, to this obligation point, we think it's very important. Because on that side of the house, they told us that these individuals benefited on some level, ladies and gentlemen, that you are provided some degree of care on that side of the house. But we think that the parent-child experience and the parent-child relationship is extremely subjective in nature, in which the developmental stages are determined based on the interpersonal relationships between parent and child, especially, ladies and gentlemen. That means we're not just looking at abuse at its most explicit terms on that side of the house, but we're also talking about what Jasmine talked about, which received absolutely no response from Michael in regards to the borderline abusive verbal or emotional treatment that you get from your parents, ladies and gentlemen, that perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, created no sort of sense of obligation under that side of the house, but apparently the parent can just assume that the child will owe an obligation back on that side of the house. The point is, the relationship and the interpersonal relationship between parent and child is a completely subjective matter. And if they say that children are not best placed to make the decision as to how good of a child that they are, the state, who is completely a non-party to that relationship, is even at a worse place to be able to be the determinant as to the interpersonal relationships of a parent and a child in that particular circumstance. Yes?
The sum total of your speech so far has shown is that there's slightly differing levels of choice on parts of the child and the parent. So we have slightly differing levels of obligation. And the parent is coerced to take care of the child by negligence laws if they don't fail.
Infinitely more options to be able to have consent versus no consent at all is not a minute difference in terms of consent levels on that side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. And just to clear away the abuse laws that are, negligence laws that are imposed upon parents, the difference here, ladies and gentlemen, is that parents had the option of taking care of that child, option of giving away that child, but chose to take care of that child anyway, and then chose and also abused those children, ladies and gentlemen, versus the child who never chose to get born into that particular circumstance in the first place. That abuse point of the opening up is wholly contingent upon whether or not children had the option of being in that circumstance to begin with. But secondly, and very importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we want to point out that the adversarial nature of having to sue your children for payment, for negligence, ladies and gentlemen, is completely counterproductive to the state's goal of cultivating parent-child relationship even in the stages of adulthood. We think the state can take a mediating role. The state can always incentivize that relationship and support those parents. But incentivizing an adversarial system is always going to create worse off positions. We are proud to oppose.
And that's your clear remarks, so I invite the government extension speaker to open up back after me. Here.
Sorry about that. Wait a second. This debate is not just about cultural and social norms, about whether or not reciprocity exists between individuals and their parents. It's also about the efficacy of providing resources to elderly people. And what Julia and I would argue is that the current system of pensions is economically inefficient, and we would argue that while FrontGov provided us a very detailed mechanism to explain why that parental symmetry and obligation exists, we're going to tell you that if that obligation exists, the reason why you should not just continue to provide it directly by taxing more and then giving people pensions is that actually individual people carry out welfare better for the state within families. That's the reason, for example, that for children under welfare, we give cash transfers to parents to spend for their children the way that we want, not just provide them them with services that they think that we need. So in this case, we think it's most effective specifically for poor people and marginalized people who can least access the average level of mainstream services that we want for these elderly people. So I'm going to present to you two main arguments. First of all, I'm going to briefly talk about investment incentives, explain that a little bit further, and then I'm going to talk about responsibilities and abilities. I think a lot of clash will be implicit, but I'll also try and do some explicit stuff. So first of all, let's expand a little bit on what opening government told us about investment incentives. So parents, when they're entering the workforce, have two major decisions about their lifetime labor supply, and that's their maternity choice and their retirement choice. Recognize that with children, the maternity choice comes with things that often are mutually exclusive with a comfortable retirement choice. So what you put into your child in terms of their level of schooling, the amount of time that you can afford to take off work to spend time with them, which we know scientifically actually correlates to how likely they are to develop and be able to get good jobs and good education in the future. I think in that sense they have to weigh against their own ability to save for their future. So they are weighing the futures of the people that they love the most in the world versus their own self-interest, which is an unfair choice for them to have to make. What this policy this extends on opening government by explaining why their savings run out, because they're forced to make this choice, and the majority of the time they will choose their children because they feel this obligation that their child cannot care for themselves. Even if that's true and their child is 18, that burden, that emotional tie exists far beyond the legal one. So in that case, this policy means now that investing in your child is a direct and guaranteed investment in your retirement and your safety and security when you go and choose to retire, which means that you are more likely to invest in your child in a way that benefits their development because it's no longer a mutually exclusive choice. So I think this means that this choice is easier and moreover is not an over-imposition to the child, because we heard from the model from front government, it's not going to be something that means that your child can no longer afford to live either. I think this has a specific impact on women, because recognize that women have specifically adverse issues in the labor market when they have children. They often are not hired because their employers think that they will leave to have children, even if that's not true, and even if they don't, they're discriminated based on their gender. They often won't be trained because firms know that they'll lose skill-specific training if they leave the workforce, and those skills will degrade. And then if they do have a child and leave the workforce, over that time when they're raising their child, their skills degrade such that when they re-enter the workforce, they can't be hired at the same level, lose out on promotions, and lose out on wages. And the problem is that structural and policy mechanisms simply can't adjust for that gender wage gap and the issues that women face when making a maternity choice that is often pressured and not actually something that they can consent to. So I think it's perfectly principally justified to pay back your personally a sacrifice that was beyond predictable for women and beyond solvable. So insofar as a woman cannot predict what income she is going to lose for having a child and the state cannot solve for it, I think it's perfectly reasonable that the individual does it themselves. Sure.
Given that even the opening government says that beyond just a monthly stipend, personal care is very important, why will an adversarial system that forces parents to sue their children for a maintenance will cultivate the kind of personal care and relationship that you want on your side?
I just really don't believe there's going to be that many cases about having to sue your children to get that money, and I also think that if you value your relationship over the child versus the nominal sum, you simply won't choose to sue them, and like they said, the state will top that up. I simply don't think that you're going to get all of these awful impacts because sometimes the legal system needs to be enforced, and some cases it does, and that benefits everyone, and if some people choose to do that, then that's going to be beneficial. So now I'm going to talk to you about responsibilities and abilities. So I think the premise is that in society, we align your ability to take care of yourself with someone's responsibility to care for you. For example, so when you are a child and have no ability to take care of yourself, there's a larger responsibility for your parent to take care of you. And as you grow and your faculties develop, the responsibility the parent has declined. So we would also see that, for example, in people who have developmental disabilities and who don't create that same skill to take care of themselves, the level of responsibility is higher for their parents. So we would say then is that is sometimes done by the state, but here is not enough and not efficient. So if that link exists, then when you reverse it, what that means is that as your ability to care for yourself declines, the responsibility of that person to care for you also increases. Yeah. So as opening opposition agrees that the state should do it, answered in a POI offered by Julia, let's explain why we would do that more efficiently. 3 reasons. First of all, information. I think that you have information specifically about your parents' cultural, linguistical, and personal and dispositional reasons of what care they would like to receive and what that looks like, which means that when you are the direct provider, or at least are able to give them money such that they can make that choice, that looks much better. Secondly is specialization and efficiency. So that's things to do with geographic proximity. Your ability to provide service to the state might be too niche, it might be focused. There's also access to a community, for example, religious networks, and there's also no need to aggregate. So you don't have to go through so many middlemen to get this service, so it's simply more efficient because it's a direct cash transfer. The third reason, though, is personal relationships and feelings. So I think that oftentimes this care is self-perpetuating, right? So that once you invest in this relationship, it continues, and not something that is subject to the political cycle of how much pensions are going to look like this year that people have no control over, but is related to your emotions. So I think that what we're doing instead is, instead of not taxing, we're proposing insourcing for those three reasons, giving a micro-ability instead. Sure, back half.
Okay, if it's the case that proximity to the individual is what allows good care, why not just have the state give cash transfers to that person themselves for them to make the choice?
Okay, first of all, because that doesn't rely on any of the principled analysis about why it's better for the person, like the child, to do it themselves. But secondly, I'm going to explain to you why, even if the government does that, it's specifically bad for minorities. So three people that are hurt: poor people, racial minorities, and cultural minorities. In terms of poor people, simply straight up insufficient resources, right? Like Medicaid doesn't cover everything, your Walmart pension doesn't cover anything, there's political resistance to passing better laws for poor people, they're often geographically precluded in terms of ghettoization, and undereducated about available resources, which means that in all of those cases, simply cash transfers aren't enough because there are barriers that they simply can't surmount, but their children are going to be able to. I think in terms of racial and cultural minorities, there's racism within government services that mean even if you give cash transfers, you're less likely to get the services that come out from them, and there's a political narrative of blame that is also attached to those kinds of cash transfers around pensions specifically to certain racial groups. I think that on our side of the house, we protect and understand that a direct investment between parents and child gives you a better economic reasons and impact, which is why this policy should pass.
Thank you for remarks. Invite the opposition extension speaker to open up the back half off space. Here.
Two unique things in closing opposition extension. First of all, we're going to give you a principled explanation for why the arbitrary specific set of birth circumstances that individuals are born in means that this policy is principally unjust. I think OO's discussion of consent was far too generalized. Second of all, we're going to explain why this actually supplants the development of social safety programs and therefore is a failure of state obligation clashing directly with closing government. As such, extension to that portion of government measures case will be integrated there. One outstanding piece of rebuttal to open the government's case then. I think they were being a little bit disingenuous about the argument that they claim, that is to say the middle class are not being cared for in the status quo, the state is not able to react as quickly, and so for example you see people waiting for weeks in their home and not being able to driven in the case of medical emergencies. One, this seems patently false, so for example 911 is the mechanism in which the state comes and then gives you to the hospital before that happens. I've also heard good things about Life Alert, so it seems to suggest the state doesn't do a terrible job, and if so, there are ways of fixing that, and government benches never provide an explanation for why this is actually bad. The United States is probably the one example of which state social welfare systems are not that good. But second of all, to engage more seriously, it seems to suggest that they're saying, well, they're subjective, that there's some subjective value that's lost here. We think the most burdensome, sort of things that they would force kids to provide are probably monetary, or things that provide a basic level of care. That is to say, we actually think the burden would be quite high. So one, if it's the case that there are non-monetary expenses, things like, for example, me flying from New York to care for my mother in LA, it doesn't seem like that's the best mechanism of getting her to the hospital, but it does seem like it is quite onerous on me when, for example, I make career choices based on how much little work time that I'm able to take off. But second of all, it also seems like the monetary aspect of that burden is especially high. One, why? Because it seems like that is necessary for government's case to be successful. That's to say that these individuals will get some modicum of care requires that there be some significant sacrifice on the other side. So presumably all of the same arguments they made about why it is hard to care for one other individual, that is to say it is a really high burden when you're caring for a child, seems like it also applies to old people as well. So for example, the fact that standards of living rise, the thing that basic goods are actually quite expensive, seems to suggest that especially for poor individuals, the burden might actually be quite high on their side of the house. The last point to rebuttal is to say, I actually don't think the philosophical premise behind this argument that there is some sort of reciprocal burden that necessitates sacrifice on both sides actually holds. Why? Because I don't actually think that old parents make decisions to have kids on the basis of this sort of altruism. That's to say, individuals can be incredibly selfish when they have kids. They want kids just because it is good for them, in which case the decision to sacrifice their kid is just to the extent that it is a weighing of the cost necessary for them to get the good of having a kid, but not necessarily sort of caring that necessitates caring on the part of the kid in the future. So that I think deals with much of what government has to to say now we're going to get to the principled stuff. No, extension proper. What is the principled, why do we think principally the arbitrary set of birth circumstances that individuals have means that their policy is unjust? So recognize, even opening government says that the fact that you are born to a random set of baby makers as opposed to a different set of baby makers is quite arbitrary. So we think that what their policy does is akin to shackling to you to the set of conditions in which you happen to have born as a result of that arbitrariness. So for example, it is just like saying that you must pay taxes to the state that you happen to be born in, even if, for example, you left the state or did not feel an obligation to that state for a variety of reasons that we think are legitimate. Opening government's argument against this is to say, well, the child is the sole recipient of those goods, which is why they certainly do owe something. But we think that that is not a transaction that actually allows those individuals to agree to that. That's to say that you cannot just give something to those individuals and then say, now you owe me something as a result. I cannot just give you, for example, a pen and say, now you owe me as a result for the rest of your life. And as such, we think that that explains why opening opposition's argument about consent was actually important. It does not generate those sorts of lifelong obligations. You've been really anxious.
Okay, you don't choose your state. It's pretty arbitrary, but you still pay it back in tax for what it has done for you. You don't choose your parents. To some extent, they don't choose you, but you still pay them back for the sacrifices they made in not being neglected.
Okay, cool. Got your argument as you said to the last speaker, and this is why. So we think that, yes, it is clearly the case that you pay taxes to the state, but you don't pay taxes necessarily to the state that you were born. So for example, the fact that my parents were originally Chinese citizens, but they don't pay taxes to the Chinese government anymore, means they had a choice about choosing whether or not they have US citizenship or Chinese citizenship. That is not true for your side of the house. You have one set of parents, and that is the people that you have owe obligations to, which is why it doesn't apply. And also, it seems like all of Oddbench makes good arguments about why that sort of choice is obviously much more of a thing, for example, whether or not parents have kids, whether or not you choose a state, than it is for whether or not you choose your parents. So that is the comparative distinction there. So then, one other argument. Opening opposition realizes it's obviously the case also here that it is reasonable for children to justifiably feel no obligation to parents for many things that might be short of abuse and neglect. That is to say, the investment in children that closing government claims might actually turn ugly. So this argument then, the response relies on there actually being good laws about prosecuting neglect and abuse. And what we're going to add is say it's actually quite hard to prosecute on that basis, which is why you get also many cases that fail the principled standard that government sets up. Why? One, it is the case that also often it is just hard to prosecute in the first place. Like, for example, the testimony of a 5-year-old is very hard to believe, it's probably less effective, and that is because the home is a private matter, so there's not much evidence when it comes to those cases. But second of all, it's often the case that only afterwards children realize the extent of the damage that was done, at which point you, for example, might question whether or not there was any evidence left, which is another reason often those cases are not very successful. Cool. Now the second part of the extension. Why do you supplant no the development of social safety programs? It's a failure of the state obligation. So to be very clear, it's obviously the case from their side of the house there'll be a decrease in the amount of the social safety net that the state provides. That is the case because it is just not necessary. So the political argument that we don't need as much of those when, for example, we consider the budget becomes a lot more tenable. The best evidence for this is probably opening government's own arguments about why the government is bad, individuals do it better. So for example, to the extent that Republicans advocate that private charities supplant welfare programs, it seems like now when you compel kids to provide that charity, now that argument is now much more powerful. So one of the other reason why this happens is also because many of the parents who presumably vote for a welfare system because they might be affected by it, for example, the middle class group that opening government claims, now are not necessarily affected by it because they just get benefits from their kids, so they no longer have an incentive to lobby that. So two problems here. First of all, we think that it's principally important to force kids to even bear a fraction of that burden. That's to say, it's not just okay for the state to top it off, because the state bears the entirety of the obligation here. So one, no, we don't think it's the case, for example, poor families use welfare, or that the poor families have an obligation to alleviate the circumstances of their own poverty. That is a result, one, because they're not the best actor to do that, because they're stuck in these systems, but also because, for example, the state is responsible for many of those conditions that led to that poverty. So that is why, for example, the state has the ability to use the mechanism of progressive taxation to allow the rich to pay for the poor when they do not have the ability. To the extent that CG thinks cash transfers for individuals to determine subjective value is important, we would say that is what a welfare system is. You give money to individuals to determine whether or not they to apply particular goods. So if parents know their own interests too, then it seems like our system still accounts for that if you just don't cut welfare. But second of all, we would say there's a huge practical effect here. That is to say, one, we don't actually think this helps women that much, unfortunately. It's kind of a weird mechanism to do so, but women still are pregnant, so it seems like in the job labor force search that still is an effect that occurs. But we think actually on their side of the house, what they do by having child support payments and now parent support payments is criminalize poverty. That is to say, child support payments are notoriously guilty for example, throwing poor people in jail because they simply don't have the ability to pay. So what the state thinks is a little amount, because yes, child support payments are also scaled, is not a little amount to poor individuals. As a result of that, those individuals often get broken into a cycle of poverty. That means it is even hard to escape the sorts of harms that CG seems to care about. That is exactly what is likely to happen on their side of the house. In which case, Wang, we would prefer that you not help those people that are richer in society if it is the case that you do not stab the poor in society, but that is exactly what you do through the detriment to the welfare system to inflict. Very proud to oppose.
Answer your remarks, and then you got to finish off the go side of the bench here.
I also thought opening government was great, but I do think it was a strategic error to ignore most of Julia's constructive material in light of only refuting opening government. The principled idea about consent is kind of important, and I'll talk about it a little bit, but it is certainly not the most important thing in this round. I think what we deliver to you uniquely on closing government, and in fact we're the only team that talks about it, which I think is a good thing for us, is that there are old people who are not cared for, they are failed by the welfare state because they are members of minorities who are precluded from having genuine access to a lot of things that people need just in order to thrive. When you are getting old, it is hard to physically get yourself around and take care of your most basic needs. The state does not meet those particularly well under status quo. Individuals are much better equipped to meet those for their parents. And I think they do have a moral responsibility, but more importantly, even if they didn't, I just think this is a more efficient system of delivering that, and therefore we stand behind it for that reason alone. And we'll take some time to explicitly refute closing opposition, and then I'm going to get into my themes. Okay, so we heard the state is okay at providing welfare. For example, they can call 911. This is totally fine. I think that is super flippant, and I think that the opposition extension recognized that that was super flippant. I think, for example, if you're an immigrant and you have children who speak a language that you don't, you actually aren't particularly able to even access things like 911, which we do consider to be the most basic and accessible service. So flippant and also incorrect. Okay, the burden, I actually don't know what that was. Oh yeah, okay. So then, like, all of op bench is like really in love with this like arbitrariness of birth, like sort of veil of ignorance argument. So I just find this philosophically uncompelling. I think once you are born, it does matter who your parents are. It matters who you are. There's a bunch of stuff that you don't choose that we still think is super morally relevant, and also there's just stuff that you have to deal with. So then their analogy when they're like, okay, this is like paying taxes to a state that then you move out of, but you're like bound to just morally arbitrarily forever. No. The thing is, you pay taxes in the state in which you live for using services that it provides you. In the analogy of having parents, you just can't pay that back while you're benefiting from the services because you're a kid. So all this is doing is postponing the point at which you are repaying for the benefits you've received. So actually, no, that analogy doesn't serve them particularly well either, even if we do buy the veil of ignorance thing, but I just think particularism is important as well. I think it really matters to you. Okay. Yeah. So second of all, it's hard to prosecute, so things like neglect and abuse are difficult to prosecute. I mean, I think if they can wave their hands and say we fix welfare, we can wave our hands and say we fix child protection services. But I do think there are other things we can do to make sure that it's, like, I don't think there's a huge problem with monitoring under status quo. I think that was exaggerated. But if there is a problem with monitoring parents being neglectful, first of all, neglectful parents are the minority of cases. Second of all, I think there are things we can do to monitor and enforce neglectful parents better under status quo while still getting all the benefits that we get uniquely on-site government, particularly site-closing government. So I don't think that's super compelling. They talked about like losing political will and voting for welfare. I think this happens anyway, right? Like the middle class, and particularly the upper middle class, is always pretty equivocal on whether or not they think welfare is a good thing, depending on like how persuasive Trump has been that week, right? I don't think that we want to make the ability of old people who are poor to get access to welfare contingent on just like the whims of the majority in the middle class. And we deliver that better and more definitely on side government. Why is that the case? Because of my themes. Okay, I'm actually going to do my first theme second. I'm going to start with, okay, I'm going to call this number one. Outcomes. Why do we get the best outcomes for old people on our side of the house? Recognize that in my POI to opening opposition, and apparently closing opposition agrees with it, everyone thinks these old people should be taken care of, right? Like obviously they are members, they're citizens of this country, they have some basic needs that they can't necessarily meet themselves because they're physically just getting old because they're socially precluded. Opening Gov gave you some reasons, Julia gave you a bunch of reasons. Particularly when these people are minorities, they are less able to access the government-provided services that are attempted to solve for that. Julia gave you several quite detailed examples of when this might be true. So she talked to you about racial minorities, she talked to you about cultural and religious minorities. What else? Oh, she talked to you about poor people. There's so many structural barriers that preclude people, things like language, things like racism, things like straight up lack of information, and things like insufficient resources that are subject to the political whims of the majority, that cause people to be prevented from accessing things like their basic medical care or like basically feeding themselves when they're subject to something like a food stamp program or when they can't just like communicate with 911. The state does not sufficiently cover the needs of these people, recognizing that everyone thinks that these people's needs deserve to be covered. Why then do we cover those better and more efficiently? Julia also gives you a ton of quite compelling reasons for that, and I'll address that after.
Excellent, cool. So we said that the poor and minority individuals that are presumably the children of these parents you care about are often thrown in jail for things like parent support payments. One, because they don't have the money, or as you suggest, because they might not understand the legal system. So it seems like your mechanism doesn't work.
I just think this is a big reach for concrete harm on side opposition when they're like, there are going to be so many suits and these people will be thrown in jail. Here's the thing about enshrining this in law, is that it does set a social norm such that most people follow it. First of all, I think the idea that the consequence is high enough means that it is a sufficient incentive so most people comply. I think usually we don't actually get to the point of suit. at all inside government. Second of all, though, I think this sends a value message because we have encoded it in law and said you do have an obligation to pay back parents who cared for you, that people do feel that they have some moral obligation. Julia addresses this when she tells you that care is self-affirming insofar as you now have entered a relationship of care with another person with whom you already have, no thank you not right now, a deep personal investment. I think that does cause people to realize things about their personal relationships with their parents that might involve taking care of them. So I think we actually don't get most people failing this and being thrown in jail. I think that is hyperbolic and just profoundly implausible. Okay, so we take care of all people the best. Okay, so why is it better in our world, and why did Julia explain this to you, when we have individuals delivering these things to their parents instead of the state delivering it? We get rid of all of the failures that I just outlined for you, that Julia went into great detail, but also there are some unique things that individuals have that the state doesn't. Things like specific information, things like an existing long-term relationship with parents, and just like an idea of what makes them comfortable, things like networks with like what is important to them, like for example a religious community. The concern that we heard vaguely articulated out of side opposition about this was that perhaps, if there is a bad relationship between a parent and a kid, that maybe this would somehow sort of like discolor this and make them less able to deliver it. I think usually that's not the case. Even if that is the case, I think people still comply and still have things like superior information on our side of the house. I think that that usually overcomes any sort of like bad feeling that you might have. But if you know that it is your legal duty to take care of your parent, even if you feel sort of icky about it, first of all, we're unconcerned because we think you take a burden off of the welfare system when you do that, and we think it's a more efficient way of delivering care for old people. But second of all, I just think that you are less likely to not comply with it if we have this kind of incentive mechanism. Second theme, very quickly, on this moral obligation thing that I've addressed, pretty inexplicit reputation, but I'm also going to go over it again. First Gov gave you reasons, like pretty good reasons, to believe that there is this reciprocal obligation. First opposition and closing opposition were concerned with the fact that you don't consent to entering this relationship where you have reciprocal obligations to take care of your parents. I just don't care that much if you consented to it. Insofar as you have materially benefited from it, I think then you just do owe something to it. And there are lots of other relationships, for example, being born into a state that you don't explicitly consent to, but we still recognize that you benefit from it and owe something to pay that back. I think this argument is a bit of a wash, not the most important part of the debate, but insofar as we're going to buy it, I think you have to buy side government and the fact that you still owe something to them. So we're very much.
Those are the remarks, but yeah, I wouldn't finish up the debate in its entirety, so you hear it.
So what we brought you in opposition extension was not just more analysis of the consent argument. What we told you is that their side of the house actually supplants the social safety net with a replacement that's worse. But first I want to do just a piece of rebuttal to something that got explained a little bit further in the GovWeb, where she says that, well, this law is going to set social norms and people are going to care for their parents more. I think this is an absurd characterization of how the vast majority of people probably do think about their relations. We would say that the vast majority of people probably voluntarily care for their parents in old age. So the cases in which that this law actually will have teeth are probably cases in which the parents are suing a child for enforcement, just like all the various child support payment lawsuits that actually do happen in large quantities of the status quo for a child that might feel very neglected or just didn't have their abuse claim heard in court. So those are the cases that we're talking about in this debate, and that's what they fail to understand on their side of the house. So, two questions in this speech. First, what moral duties accrue on the basis of parenthood or being a child? And secondly, practically, is implementing this in a form of a legal obligation realistic or plausible? So we got the line of argumentation that because the children receive benefits, this generates a reciprocal obligation. We gave you two responses to that. First, we rejected the idea that merely because you're born into a certain group of people, or a certain group of people chose for your existence, means that you have an obligation to them. We don't think that you have an obligation to repay the state that you lived in for like K-12 education if you choose not to swear allegiance to that state as an adult. Because we think that you can choose who and what individuals and what institutions provide subjective meaning to you in your life. And we don't think that it's just stuff you have to the stuff you have to deal with as the government trivially says, we think that there are significant harms when individuals feel neglected and are legally forced to like, for example, pay for a parent in old age. Secondly, we told you that the absence of legally culpable harm that's been proven doesn't constitute an active fulfillment of parental duty. We told you first that it's difficult to bring cases of abuse in extension because, like, the statute of limitations might expire by the time the person realizes the trauma that was done to them, because there are lots of things that are legally short of abuse that can't be brought to court, or because there's no advocate for the children who are being abused in the status quo while they're children to actually bring those suits to court. So we think there are a significant number of cases where you're going to have children being forced to provide for parents that actually didn't provide for them. I'll take opening.
Look, this policy is a reciprocal neglect law. If your parent has chosen after your birth not to neglect you, you should not neglect them, irrespective of whether they chose to have you or not. They chose not to neglect you.
Okay. I think that principle might sound nice in theory, but what we just brought to you in extension that POI ignored is that there are a significant number of cases in which that legal standard of culpability cannot be enforced in the real world, and I think that they haven't explained to you why the existence of that principle, even if they prove that it's principle, means that it should generate an obligation to implement that in law with teeth. Secondly, they told you that parents are coerced to have children. We think that as the opening set up for you, parents can rationally decide whether or not they can afford to have a child, whereas a child is born into that circumstance and has no control over the decision of whether or not they chose to exist in the first place, right? The presence of social factors that influence your decision to have a child doesn't amount to coercion any more than the presence of advertising it means that you can't freely choose to buy something. We think that insofar as that is the case, we think that parents have vastly more choice than a child in this circumstance, so we think that that's not the case. But secondly, even if it's the case, what we brought to you is that if it's the case that the state is the one, through a variety of legal and financial factors, influence a parent's decision to have a child, we think the state is the one that is responsible. You shouldn't force that on the marginalized individuals, like the children of the poor, to implement that obligation. Closing.
Why do we enshrine a legally minimum standard of care for parents to their children?
Okay, because they chose to have that child, they take on the obligation, while the child never chose to be born in that circumstance and deserves some kind of standard. I think that's absurd. The final line of argumentation on the principle analysis was that the burdens were unequal because parents sacrificed more. We gave you two responses. First, we told you that not a lot of parents don't sacrifice that much, but children might have to sacrifice a significant extent to care for their parents in old age. But secondly, and more importantly, something that the government mentioned never responded to, is that people don't necessarily sacrifice to have that child in the first place, because there's lots of selfish reasons why people have children, like living vicariously, establishing a legacy through that person, etc. That means that it doesn't constitute a sacrifice at all. The second question in this debate is just practically, is this legal obligation realistic and good? We gave you two arguments that I think that take out the closing government extension. The first was that you actually supplant the social safety net. So even if there is difficulty in actually establishing welfare for marginalized groups, e.g. is difficult and hard and politically difficult to do so in a number of circumstances, we told you that you actually empower the rhetoric that drives that marginalization at the point where people can say that they're being taken care of by their children, so we don't need to actually pass any policies to help those individuals and redress the circumstances of their marginalization. That's something that they never responded to. So if that is a fact of political life, they make it far worse on their side of the house, and they haven't explained to you any mechanism by which they solve that. Secondly, we told you that the enforcement mechanism actually harms the poor, right? So what happens on their side of the house is that it might be difficult to get change because there's like a culture of shame around welfare benefits or whatever, but they just further marginalize the children of the poor at the point where they say that those individuals are the ones that have to care for their parents in old age, rather than push for progressive policies that might change. So even if it is difficult, we think it's a comparatively better avenue and more fair avenue of political advocacy than simply marginalize the poor. So, but that's assuming that those poor children can actually pay for their parents in old age, right? So in a lot of circumstances, it might be the case that they can't do so, at which point the children are going to be what? Like slapped with fines because they can't pay for their parents in old age, or they just end up relying on the state anyway, and the state's top-up constitutes the vast majority of the payments that go to this old parent. So at that point, we think their policy just entrenches the marginalization of those groups without actually substantially solving the issue. We think the proximity benefits that they identified were clearly taken out by the fact that we told you in a POI, if it's the case of the more proximate you are to the person, means that you have better understanding of their interests, we would just prefer the state give direct cash transfer to the parent in the first place so they can choose what they want. At the end of this debate, there are two key issues. First, we think the most important issue is that they actually haven't demonstrated why this reciprocal obligation is generated in any meaningful sense, even if it's the case that the intuition is how people act in the status quo. Secondly, we told you that this obligation was just not realistic to enshrine in the law and would be applied only in cases where that actually harms the child. For that reason, we oppose.